So what we wanted to do today was to go into some detail about key decisions that the board needs to make as we begin the process of rebuilding our 4 elementary schools. So what we hope to accomplish today is to help you to understand the decisions that the board needs to make, also review and discuss the high-level timeline for key governance decisions. So what we are, the way that I'm looking at it, so this is obviously for discussion purposes. And then, because there's a significant amount of interest in the community around what happens next, we also wanted to sort of put in front of you what we think the process looks like and the timeline looks like for beginning the rebuilding process. So those are our goals for tonight. We're going to start with the first one, which is understanding the decisions. And probably from my perspective, the most important one is to deal with governance. And so that basically is who's making what decisions, so that as staff we can begin to get work done and know where, if you will, where the buck stops in the process. And so, you know, the reason is because it has implications for the work. So it has implications for determining the sequencing when we start projects, you know, how many projects we do at a time and things along those lines. Also to make decisions about, you know, key aspects of the process. So, you know, how we're actually proceeding with the construction, and also whether we incorporate fair contracting into the RFPs as those RFPs are built out. And so, you know, who gets to make those decisions is an important part of the next steps from our perspective. So let's talk a little bit about what we know. And so a couple board meetings ago, we had Bill Stockmeyer, who has been our attorney on this issue. Bill leads, as you know, the government practice at Drummond Woodsum and is well-versed in the governance issues associated with school construction projects. And in his presentation, which is included in your packet, you have the first page, which he reviewed, which was not a part of your packet back in at the time that he did the presentation, but that's been in your packet. We sent it out separately as well, so you've had a chance to see that. And so what we asked Bill to do is to look at, given that it's been since 2007 that the city has been involved in a locally funded project with the Riverton project, what does the city charter say about the way that those projects are organized, and how is that different from the way that other projects have been organized, you know, dating back to the Riverton project as well as, you know, the subsequent projects, Hall, Ocean Avenue, East End, and so on. So we asked them to look at what does the city charter say and what does state law say about the way in which those types of projects are organized. And so today we're going to talk through some of his legal review. I want to emphasize that the city attorney has a somewhat different perspective that is largely based on past history, not necessarily on a separate, you know, argument with the statutory and legal provisions that that Bill Stockmeyer provided. So just moving on with that. So what does the city charter say about the management of locally funded projects? And so first, it's important to note that the city charter vests the school board with all authority to manage and care for the schools, except as otherwise provided in the charter. In other words, anything that isn't specifically called out in the charter as the as somebody else's responsibility or authority. It's the school board's authority. The charter does not provide any limits for the board's authority as specified for construction projects. In other words, to that first a quotation there, except as otherwise provided in the charter, there is nothing in the charter that specifies that the board has anything other than all authority to manage and care for the schools when related to school construction projects. So, you know, in conclusion, the board's authority for school construction is in essence the same that's vested on the board in state law. So given that there's nothing in the charter that that sort of would call for it being any different, it's the same that's in state law. The charter is important to note that the charter does call for collaboration between the city and board on all aspects of the management of the schools. So I think that that's not anything that is foreign to anybody on this board. So what is required of the Board of Education on a locally funded school construction project? So state law, and that's the specific citation, provides that school boards are responsible for the custody, the management, and the care of school buildings. The state law does specify that for state-funded construction projects, the school board is the building committee unless the legislative body, so in this case the city council, exercises its authority under that provision of Title 20 to appoint another building committee. And so that is in fact what's happened historically in Portland. It's what happened with the Hall project, the Ocean Avenue project, and the East End project. It is also what happened with the Riverton locally constructed project. But, you know, again, that's factual, and it's a historical reference, but there isn't a provision in state law that would provide the legislative body with the authority to do that, other than if the board, in essence, yields that authority to them in the context of collaboration and cooperation as two entities. So what the statute specifies is that the school board has all of the authority for the management and care and custody of schools, and thus the school board is the building committee unless it takes a affirmative step to vest that authority and that responsibility on somebody else. So we'll talk about that. That could be vesting that authority on the city council, vesting that authority on an advisory committee, but at all times the board retains accountability for the project. So this is ultimately you're accountable for the execution of these projects. So let's talk a little bit about past practice, and so I'm going to walk through the messy slide. Did not look that way in my, does it look that way in the printed copy? Is it run over? Okay, good. So then read the printed copy. The way that it's worked is that the City Council actually acted on that provision in state statute that grants it the ability to appoint a building committee in a state-funded project, which is what Hall is. And in that setting, the council authorized a committee, and it charged it with planning, design, and construction of the Hall building. Some of the elements, and you have in your packet, and for members of the public, you probably probably picked one up on the way in. The actual document that was issued by the city that lays out the charge of the Hall Building Committee. And so it specifies that they plan, design, and construct. It specifies that working with the superintendent, with school staff and architects, that the committee makes design, program, and financial decisions. It specifies that the committee is charged with developing a budget subject to oversight by the council and by the state DOE, obviously because it is a state project. The state DOE is integrally involved in all aspects of the construction, and it specifies that it may establish subcommittees. The Hall Committee originally had 15 members. It now has 16, as one former councilor was added in. So it has 2 city councilors, 3 school board members, 10 members of the public. The thing for those who are watching this and only seeing what's on the screen, what's garbled in there is just that you can reference the document that I mentioned, which is the Hall Construction Committee Charter, which is in the board packet as well. Riverton, the last locally funded project that happened here in Portland, I believe between 2005 and 2007. That was also authorized by the City Council and it was charged with, quote, overseeing the renovation. The detailed charge was to review design and program recommendations. There was no specific provision for working with superintendent or school staff, which you saw is a part of the more updated version of it. So I'm not 100% sure the context in which that was not there and is there now, but it is there in the Hall project. The committee was charged with overseeing costs and expenditures, and there was no provision for subcommittee. So I don't know that that means that it didn't happen, but there was no explicit mention for that. That had 7 members. In that case, there were 2 city councilors, and councilors is misspelled, and 1 school committee member, and 4 members of the public. That's the school councilors, not the city councilors, so my apologies. And the 4 members of the public that were a part of that. We also took a look at how other Maine districts that have locally funded projects, how they are currently managing those projects. And so we are highlighting here Brunswick and Westbrook. Those are 2 current projects in settings where there is a municipal, so those are municipal districts. We also will talk briefly about Kennebunk in a second, but these are 2 projects that are in settings similar to ours. And you'll see that in the Brunswick, the school committee was appointed by mutual agreement of the school board and the town council. It's assigned to assist in the design and construction, everything from assisting with preliminary steps to overseeing the construction management. It's made up of 11 members, 5 are school board members, 2 are town council members, and 4 are members of the public. In this case, it's staffed by the superintendent, the school facilities manager, and the school business manager. Westbrook is a board-appointed building committee, so this was appointed exclusively by the school board, and it's charged with handling the day-to-day aspects of school construction, although from our review of the documentation, it does not appear to have met recently, so I'm not sure how involved they are in the day-to-day aspects of that actual construction. It reports back to the school board regularly. There are 14 members to our school board representatives. 1 is a city councilor. There are multiple administrators who actually sit on that building committee. So unlike the Brunswick one, where they staff the committee, there are administrators as well as school faculty members who are on that building committee. So just very quickly, Kennebunkport, and Arundel. They're an RSU, so obviously it's a little bit of a different configuration. They don't have the city representation on there, but they do have multiple school board members. They have 3 staff and a student who sit on the building committee. This is a project that actually just finished, so they opened the Kennebunkport High School this past September. So what are some generalizations that you can draw from the way in which those are organized? I think it's fair to say that school boards have the overall responsibility for those locally funded projects. In all of the instances, they are the majority of the elected officials on the committee. In all of those cases, members are appointed by the school board or a committee of the school board, and responsibilities were determined by the school board. City is involved in both of the municipal projects in the same way that you saw in our history of the Portland projects. And the number and composition is pretty much all over the place. So, you know, you saw the size, 16 at Hall, 14 in Brunswick, 11 in 11 in Westbrook, 9 in Kennebunk, 7 in Portland for the Riverton project. So staff sometimes are voting members of the committee, and sometimes they staff the committee without having votes. So there's no sort of, there doesn't appear to be a specific structure for that. And the size varies, and it's not clear to me that, so if you have more responsibilities, it's a larger committee or a smaller committee, so it's not clear whether the size is a function of that or if it's just, local circumstances and the timing of those decisions. Okay, so implications for you. As I talked to Chair Tavaro and to Ms. Davis as we were thinking about this, we thought it would be important to put in front of the board what we think are the possible governance options that you have that we will be sort of contemplating as we move forward. And one of them is, what is very much considered the sort of what's the limits under the state statute, and that is the school board acting as the building committee. It also is a possibility that the board can delegate those responsibilities to the superintendent. You can also appoint a subcommittee that oversees construction projects. So, for example, the operations committee is an existing body of the board that could act as the overseer of the construction projects. You can also appoint an advisory committee that could support either the board or the operations committee in the development and management and oversight of those construction projects. Or you can defer to the city council to appoint a building committee, as you saw has been the history for both state-funded projects where that was actually it's a specific power of the city council in a municipal setting for state-funded projects, and also has been the way that that Portland organized for the Riverton projects. So just a couple of notes that one is sort of, I've said this a number of times and I just keep coming back to it. By law, our understanding is that the board has oversight responsibilities, regardless of what other actions you take. At the end of the day, the board is accountable. And then I think it's important to also note, in terms of thinking about this in charges to the committee, that city ordinance limits the awarding of contracts, the role of elected officials in the awarding of contracts. And so by city ordinance, you do not have that, that ability. So whatever you wind up doing at the end, the awarding of the actual contracts is something that staff, so in this case the superintendent and the superintendent's staff, they will be making the recommendations, the awarding of those contracts. Okay, so just to look at this a little bit further. There we go. Tried to lay out pros and cons of each options around these two sort of filters of engagement and efficiency. Engagement meaning that by doing it this way, you increase buy-in, increase opportunities for the for various stakeholders to be involved in the decision-making process, and efficiency in terms of the ability, given that the board has ultimate responsibility, the speed at which decisions can be made and sort of approved by the body that ultimately has the responsibility for making those decisions. And so obviously if you choose to be the building committee, engagement is minimal. It's the people at the table, and it's very efficient because you're making the decisions for, you know, the decisions that you've already reviewed and put in front of your, in front of the body. To have the operations committee as a building committee, that I think has moderate possibilities in terms of engagement. The reason it's more so than the board is the tradition of this board is that we have much more open settings for committee meetings, you know, so to take it to the extreme, you saw the recent policy around transgender and gender expansive youth. There were tons of engagement opportunities for members of the community. They were there. They were participants in the planning and shaping of that. So, you know, to the extent that that exists, the rules for engagement are loose for the committee structure, and so it would give you an opportunity to have people come and not have to wait for the appropriate place in the agenda, be limited to 3 minutes, and, you know, all of those things that are traditionally the way that you get feedback from people in board meetings. It's fairly efficient in terms of the way that it runs, because that's an existing body that, you know, consistently makes recommendations to the board through the existing committee structure. You could appoint an advisory committee, as I mentioned. That would be a high level of engagement, depending on how many people you actually wanted to have in it. It would be more or less representative of community input. It's less efficient. Advice would need to be brought to the board, and if it were advisory committee to the operations committee, it would have to go to the operations committee, and then it would come to the board, which you would be in the position of reviewing, approving, or modifying the recommendations. Delegating it to the superintendent, obviously minimal engagement, and it would be fairly efficient in that, you know, as superintendent, I report to the board already, so there's an established mechanism for me bringing things to you on a regular basis. Hybrid, so I talked a little bit about this a minute ago. For example, the operations committee being vested with the day-to-day management responsibilities, but with a standing advisory committee. So instead of just opening up the meetings and hoping people come, nominating and naming a group of people that would then be attached to the operations committee for all issues related to the building of these projects. And so that is high level of engagement. You would be able to, again, depending on the size size of that committee, have representation as broad as you wanted it to be. It's fairly efficient for all the things that we talked about before. It comes directly through the Operations Committee, which is already a body of the board. And then the last one is to allow the council to appoint the building committee, and you can't see that fully in there. So that is high. So it's obviously it's high engagement, and then you can see the notes on the appointing of the advisory committee, somewhat less efficient in that it would not be coming through an existing committee structure, so it would be an added committee that would have to come and report to the board and so on. Okay, so as I talked to Chair Tavaro and Ms. Davis, they asked that, I make a recommendation, so I bring this humbly to you. And again, this is for discussion, not something that I feel is the only way to go. I just wanted to sort of put a straw man up there for people to go ahead and rip it to shreds or light it on fire or whatever you want to do. So, Ms. Morioni, go for it. Just kidding. Never let you forget. So I believe that it would make sense to appoint the Operations Committee to oversee the project. So it's in essence the hybrid approach that I had in the pros and cons. And then I think it should be the Operations Committee with a 6-member advisory committee that would include 2 representatives from the City Council and 1 representative each from all 4 schools. That group would advise the Operations Committee on project management and also have responsibility for being a go-between with the constituents in those four buildings. I believe that in terms of staffing it should be staffed by the 4 building principals, the superintendent, and the facilities director. And they would not be voting members of the committee. They would be staff to sort of separate the role as staffing and advising from the board of from the role of the subcommittee. So that's my recommendation. And we're going to move on to the next thing, so it probably would be a good time to sort of pause and let you have discussion, questions, and things along those lines before we move on to the governance decision timeline. How do you want to run this? Just sort of people, I acknowledge people and, okay, all right. Go for it.
I just wondered, you mentioned that the principals would be staffing the recommendation. The representatives from the schools, who would that be if not the principals?
Yeah.
So the question was that the 4 building principals were included as part of the staff, and I was wondering what representatives from the schools would be.
Somebody from the community, in the same way that there are representatives from the community on the Hall project, people that are involved in the parent-teacher organization, individuals from the school community that have high level of interest, maybe some, real sort of knowledge and skills around construction projects, things along those lines. It would go through the appointments committee structure that exists for the board, is the way that I was envisioning it. So, in that structure, we usually talk to principals, get some names, bring that to the appointments committee. The appointments committee makes a recommendation to the board, and then the board appoints those members.
Great, thanks.
Sarah, and then Lori.
So over the years when we've been talking, which is many years, about the buildings for our future, and we talked about the day that we would get here, and we talked about a super committee, and some of and I probably have the papers, but the concerns were that the school board itself as the building committee, the school board turns over. And then also by putting it through a committee, that also turns over. And so when we had talked in the past about a super committee, because this was going to be over 4 or 5 years, and with the board turning over, you would have the consistency by appointing this super committee, which would be made up of community members, board members, but then also people that may transition, whether it be a counselor or a school board member, et cetera, from one role to another. But I hope that we would look at that further, because my concern is, one is this has been a long in coming, and I think the more engagement we have with the community, the better. And I don't want it to be boxed in to an operations committee. I think that advisory-wise, working or talking about getting an update maybe from this super committee, and then having periodic updates with the board, and obviously the board remains that power to make the ultimate final decisions. I think the difference between us and Brunswick and Westbrook is those are onesies, and we're doing 4 to 5 here. I mean, four, excuse me, not 5. We're doing 4 schools. We might do 5, but 4 schools, and then depending on what happens with the state, we may be doing more. But the difference is that we have this over a span of 4 to 5 years. And so I'd like us to explore further maybe this 6th option of a super committee made up of various components that you laid out. And then again, the board remaining with the power. But I think that it's important that we do collaborate with our city counterparts. When we formed the Hall School Building Committee and I was chair, I worked with the mayor at that time, Mr. Brennan, and we went back and forth and collaboratively came together and then brought that to be looked at. So the only other thing I have, so I guess I have very, very strong concerns about the appointment of the Operations Committee to oversee the project, but also such a small 6-member advisory committee. This is a major deal, and I feel pretty strongly that we need to have a bigger committee, not unwieldy, but have representative of what our community is, and also, yeah, I guess that's all I'll say right now. Thank you.
Davis.
I think we want to keep sight of the fact that the way the Hall Building Committee was constructed and put together is because that's a state-funded project, and this is not a state-funded project. And I think this brings us back to our attorney's analysis of how those two things are different, notwithstanding the way Riverton was done, but that the actual law provides for a different approach, which is not to say that we shouldn't work with the city council, but that we need to do it the way Riverton was done. Sounds like it would actually take affirmative action on our part to cede our responsibility as the building committee under state law to the city council to do what the state sees as our job for us. And I think that we do need to look at the law and follow the law. Just because it was not followed in the past, or perhaps was different at that time, to me is not a strong enough argument to go with what was done before. We were actually talking during our group about creativity and innovation, and that sometimes the board can get stuck in what happened before. One of the tensions that's here is, how do you get this done? These are not building new schools from scratch with state funds. This is not that size or scope of project. None of them are. None of them are. We're spending nearly $30 million on Hall, and we do have a bigger building committee. It is difficult to get us all together. That's an ongoing challenge. There have been some changes and some turnover in some of that about people who don't live in Hall District anymore, or as with the city councilor former city councilor who remains on the building, people turned over. So that turnover is an issue, but we want to get these buildings built efficiently, both in terms of time and financially. And so I think we need to think very carefully about the time that we are asking of our staff and of ourselves to get these done. And to also be recognition, it is a big deal, but this is not as big a deal as Hall. It just isn't. It's not the same size or scope of project. None of the four of them are. They're much smaller projects, and therefore I think a smaller committee probably makes sense. The one constituency that I think we do need to make sure that we include are those people who are, like myself, not parents. Folks like Tim, who is not, doesn't have children in the schools yet, or Mark, whose folks are actually the majority of taxpayers in the city and who will be footing the bill. And I think those folks need to have a seat at the table and an understanding of what we're doing, because we're going to be asking an awful lot from them. And if we want to maintain or continue their initial approval of the referendum and willingness to raise this kind of tax money, they need to be at the table. This is not just about parents and kids who happen to be at the schools right now, because this is really a long-term thing. I guess I'm leaning towards the hybrid. I think that we can get this done quickly and efficiently, that we don't want to spend a lot of time in committee stuff. One of the reasons the Hall Building Committee works is that we don't have to, the Hall Building Committee doesn't come back to you folks and tell you what we're doing. We just do it. We talk to the State Board of Ed. That's where our interface really is in terms of approval. That's whose approval we needed to get to move forward, along with the public's at the referendum point. For a locally funded project, our approval is much more important, and so I think it's important that the committee also be more tightly interspersed with us. And given that the board will turn over probably during the lifetime of completing all these projects, it's important that the entire board be not too far away from it, so that when turnover happens, there still are people who were there when a decision was made this year that now is having an impact 4 years from now, and some of the folks on the board aren't here, that there are some folks on the board who can remember that. I'm not sure that we would necessarily buy a whole lot more consistency with a super committee, and that super committee would have to keep coming back and educating a new board every single time it wanted to make a decision. So that was some of my thinking about the importance of tying it very tightly to the board, because the board is the decision maker here. So just some thoughts.
Ms. Mariani?
Thank you for the presentation and laying it out so well for us. I think I'm listening to what board members have said so far, and I'm thinking about, and having been on the Hall Committee all these years too, and seeing how that works, I'll just point out what I like about the structure of the Hall Committee. It has a lot of public participation in it. And those people that are on that Hall Building Committee are parents, but also those parents are engineers or architects or work in construction themselves. Like, they have actually expertise that I, as a mere board member, don't have. So when it's brought to us, a recommendation by our architects or our construction firm, they can look at it and go, well, actually, have you thought about this, or have we priced out this? So I would like to see us make sure that our public engagement is somehow two-pronged, in that it can capture some of that extra knowledge that we don't have. That's where I feel a little bit wiggy, thinking, wow, we're going to oversee this, and I know nothing about, construction type, So, but I appreciate the fact that you say, our facilities director will be there. He has all of the other schools to manage and operate in the same time. So, and looking even at our principals and even you, that's a lot to put on you. So,
I do just want to, if I can interject for 1 second, I do want to remind the board that the projects do contemplate additional staff that can be the owner's rep, construction manager positions.
That's what I was going to mention. Yeah, that's what I was going to mention, to ensure that also becomes really more of the conduit between the board and and you and the staff.
Which is not to preclude from your point, which I think, I think I made earlier as well, that, the people that could be the community representatives on this could be people that have, specific knowledge and expertise that also helps the sort of, related to the construction projects.
Yeah, and I do appreciate Ms. Davis's point around it's not a whole new school, it's not the 22-step process or 21-step process of the state. It takes us lots and lots of time and lots of meetings, and I actually would agree with Ms. Davis that it's been often difficult to get us all together to meet when we are a large 15-person body to meet. I definitely like the idea that we're including counselors in the meeting. I definitely like the idea that, again, that we are staying in touch with the public and ensuring that they are offered the possibility of being part of the committee. And however, the operations committee being the one to oversee the work, I actually would like, it's slight hybrid to the hybrid, is that it would be a committee that's appointed by our appointments committee. It would be run in parallel or working in collaboration with our operations committee, but our operations committee still has work to get done that's even separate from this work. So to be reporting back, continually reporting back to whether it be operations committee or the full board, I just want it to be efficient, and I think Ms. Davis has a point about how to make sure we're moving along at a good pace and not delaying any of it as it's been further delayed. And one thing I'd like even for this committee to look at is maybe of these 4 schools, let's say, and this isn't accurate, but let's say they all needed a new roof. Well, why don't we project out new roofing for all 4 simultaneously in a summer? Why don't we look at them more collectively, possibly, instead of staging out 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what I think a building committee, separate apart, that had some additional knowledge and assistance could bring. So I don't know if that was helpful or not, but I guess it's a hybrid of the hybrid. But I appreciate and I don't think we need to get very large. So thank you for that.
Anyone else?
This is not for debate, but I was looking at Ms. Crocker and myself, and I know Ms. Davis has been there for the majority of the meetings as well, but in recognition of the people for the building committee, we have not had a hard time pulling people together, and almost every single parent, community member have been at every single meeting. So I just want to make sure that we recognize that they have been at every single meeting, and so it hasn't been challenging to get them together. I don't want to lose sight of that, and I think Ms. Crocker would agree with me that it's been a
Mr. Rodriguez, and then we can come back to Ms. Davis. Unless, was it just directly related to that, so if you don't mind? Yeah.
It was, because just as one of the co-chairs, I think there's a step before a meeting gets called that happens, and I respect your perspective, which is that by the time we notified folks that there was going to be a meeting, a lot of potential meeting dates had already been eliminated because there were conflicts. So I think that it's, once we had a meeting, people were very good about getting there. And we did try to keep to a relatively, consistent date and time. But there were a number of times when, the issue of needing a meeting was raised, and we weren't able to meet as quickly as possible because there were conflicts that just had to be worked out before we even got to going to the committee. So, and that was just among a relatively small number of key people who had to be at the meeting to begin with. So it was harder to schedule than it may have appeared. I'm glad it appeared as easy as it was, and I'm really glad that people came. But it wasn't always simple from a co-chair perspective.
Thank you, Javier, for the presentation. First of all, just a heads up that the slide prior to the recommendations where the chart is on the printout, it cuts off the last little bit. So for whatever we make available to the public, maybe we can format it differently so that everything is included. And then, so I wanted to ask Just to clarify, and I guess to ask what Ms. Davis asked a minute ago, when we recommend, or when your recommendation comes to include one representative each from the 4 schools to advise, and I think Tim asked the question and you started to answer it. Are you envisioning literally one member from the public in the district that belongs, or in the in the neighborhoods that belong to it? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a parent. It could be, like Ms. Davis pointed out, that's important to her. It could be just any constituent.
Again, I think, the appointments committee would define some parameters. We would, work to get people that fit into that picture and bring them to the appointments committee for that.
Yeah. So I think most of the board, if not all of the board, would feel strongly that the public is included. So I think as we were looking through the other examples, the first thing that popped out, and I leaned over to Marnie and I said, look how many people from the public were here, and that was kind of stood out. So we definitely want to emphasize that and appreciate that being part of the recommendation. And then to the point of the super committee, or to the idea of the super committee, I think initially that really resonated with me and it made a lot of sense. But as I thought more about it, I think that a turnover of board members, even in the committee level or as a board as a whole, is something that we deal with in all aspects of our work. Mostly, we were just a moment ago talking about governance work and our direction in terms of achievements. And a lot of the questions that were coming up is how do we keep a constant vision as we have turnover? So I don't think that the challenges that turnover bring to our work is unique to this project. I think it's something that the board always has to deal with. And in a way, it's good practice. It is good practice. It's part of the democratic process. And, we pick up what we don't get a clean slate every time we get elected to one of these positions. We have to work with what has been put in place before our time. So I feel comfortable with the recommendations of having an operations committee, even if throughout the duration of the project there's turnover in the committee and throughout the board. I think that's something that we should expect. I think those were the major takeaways. I think there's still a lot of hopefully more questions and discussions that'll give more insight to what we ultimately are going to decide. Thank you.
Anyone else at this? Students?
I'm sorry, students. So one of the examples included, one of the other district examples included students. Exactly. I'm assuming that those weren't elementary school students that were serving.
It was the Kennebunk High School, so I would suspect it was a high school student.
So yeah, was there a discussion around whether or not students? No. I wonder if any of my colleagues have any thoughts or ideas about that, or even our student reps. I think, how do they feel about it?
You're on the spot. I think I'm sorry, the question is the extent to which it would make sense to have student involvement in a committee. Again, I think this is to Sarah's point. I think no matter what we do, and to other points, to Roberto's point as well, no matter what we do, there's going to be turnover. And, this is going to be a 4 to 6 year, set of projects that, even parents can potentially move out of district and things along those lines. So I think that, we are going to have to deal with something that is as, prolonged as this with, I think the key, there needs to be some, consistency, and hopefully that's minimally the staff that are, going to be consistent throughout this process. But, still don't plan on going anywhere. I think that, there has to obviously be a level of consistency, but, there's going to be turnover. And obviously with students, you're going to have turnover. So.
Yeah, with students, we have a student representative on the operations committee, so it would mean that there would automatically be turnover in that position. But the note I kind of made to myself is that we need to strategically plan for, as Roberto said, it is simply part of what we deal with. And so we need to be thoughtful and strategic as we plan for and anticipate that there will indeed be turnover. And so how do we create and memorialize the work and make sure that there is enough there that it can be picked up, that it really is a relay race of work, that this is going to be, that's probably a good analogy visually for folks, that the work is going to get passed from hand to hand over time, because the likelihood that, somebody who's appointed this year is still going to be either sitting around this dais or on that committee, or, that many years from now, may or may not be the case. We should plan that probably people will turn over, so, and we would get student involvement through the operations committee.
Yep. So a tentative timeline for making these governance decisions, assuming that, we're having this conversation and, we go forward from here, I would expect that, again, meeting with Chair Tararo and with Ms. Davis, that we would bring forward a first read to the next to the next board meeting on the 19th to appoint, if it's my recommendation, the one that you got today, to appoint the operations committee as building committee and appoint an advisory committee. So that would be then followed on January 2nd by actual action by the board on that decision, and then our goal would be to bring a slate of committee members for appointment by the board. So that would imply that between the 2nd and the 16th, that we would come up with some names, that we would discuss them with the appointments committee, and then the appointments committee would bring to the board a slate of candidates to appoint to the advisory committee. An alternate, and I honestly have not mapped this out, is if you sort of pass this responsibility on to the city council, there is a process on the city council side as well that will need to follow, that they'll need to follow in order to get to a slate. And I've not fully, mapped that out with city staff, but I would assume that it's not going to be any faster than the process that you're seeing there. So that's the sort of tentative timeline that I came up with based on my recommendation. Ms. Seeliger and then Ms. Moriani.
How would we go about engaging and getting community members involved?
How about it, or how would we? Probably through the principals. I mean, that's how we are doing the Ocean Avenue identification of parents that would be in that particular committee. We could also open it up to, email the chair of the operations committee, email the chair of the appointments committee, email the superintendent if you're interested in this, and then, do the due diligence on those people and bring a slate of folks to the appointments committee. Ms. Mariani.
So based on your timeline, it automatically assumes that we're going with the version recommended, and I don't really know if we've fully vetted that.
So
I just wanted to pause for a moment and make sure that the board collectively agrees that it's going to be going to the operations committee to be next. I don't think there was a collective anything.
Yeah, and I not to sort of state the obvious, but even if that were the recommendation that we brought forward to you as staff, which again, and that's not to preclude from the fact that, this is why we're having it here as a workshop, to have some substantive discussion about it. But if we did, and then, somebody, that could be voted down, there could be an alternative, an amendment made to that motion to do something different, that, it would be handled through the board's procedures to actually deal with that particular recommendation. So, and again, I think it would behoove us to make a recommendation that people have expressed their full views on, so that there aren't any surprises at the time that we bring it forward. So, by all means, that's why I said it was a straw man and asked for somebody to...
I will just restate what I said before, which is I do not think the Operations Committee should be the one that's appointed to oversee the Building Committee. I mean, it shouldn't be one and the same.
Yeah.
It should be a separate appointed committee that could work in tandem with the Operations Committee, but not the Operations Committee leading this work. That's my view.
Yeah. Are there others that want to express their thoughts on this? I think it would be helpful to, board leadership and for me as we sort of shape what it is that we would want to bring forward on December 19th. So, Ms. Vindel.
So the proposal, one of the proposals that's in front of us that staff is recommending has the crux of board involvement and engagement in this work around the Operations Committee. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is, one, what is it, so what would happen with the Operations Committee existing work? What would happen with all of the planning, the work around the CIP, the work around the food service, transportation? I mean, I guess I'm at a loss to see how this would, I would be worried about the committee work. I would also worry about those who wish to serve, the things that we've liked. So that's one point. Is what happens with the existing committee work. The second thing, which is something that I've observed over time. I've never been a part of a building committee or advisory committee for a new building, but what I've appreciated about our participation as board members is that it's usually something that we can opt into, that we can offer ourselves, and obviously it would be based on the appointment of the chair, but it seems like it would be very limited to those who would actually serve on the Operations Committee to have actual formal decision-making, power as a committee member. And I think that's a missed opportunity for those who want to serve on two committees and also want to be a part of an advisory committee for one of the buildings. That said, I also understand the approach of trying to streamline it. My hope is that we would have 3 board members and an advisory as part of an advisory committee, and I think it absolutely makes sense that we have some overlap with members of operations, but I don't think we should be exclusively Operations Committee, especially since I don't even know who is going to be on operations, and we won't know until December 19th. And so for me, that's, as much as I know we have the ability to give our committee preferences, I also know that there are times I've never gotten on the committees that I've wanted, and I'm grateful for the last few years I've gotten the committees that I wanted, but I know that for new board members or even, older board members with experience who do want to serve, I think that this is an area of interest, and I think that, the more engagement that we can have, that's within reason, I think that would be a stronger approach for doing this.
I think if everyone on board wants to have a role in doing this, and then we need to simply go to number one, which is the whole board as a whole is the building committee. Building projects usually have ups and downs, and we've seen this certainly with hall building committee. I mean, the board is the building committee ultimately, legally. We delegate to other groups here. Building projects, once you've got your size, your scope, your sense of where things are going, and you've got your people who are set up to do them, having done a fair amount of building in my life, of certainly not projects of this size, but projects, then you are simply taking care of change orders and things, and unexpected, which with renovation projects is very likely. You know, there will be things we run into on these projects that aren't in the referendum, aren't in the scope, aren't anywhere that we have to deal with in order to move forward. If the board wants to have constant control over it, then it probably makes sense to have the board be the building committee. Otherwise, to have a separate committee, you're asking members of the board to continue to serve on 2 or more committees, because we don't have a group, you know, that exactly fits. We had the 4 committees at one point, every member on 2 committees, but we have now a 5th committee. This would be adding a 6th committee, so we're beginning to stretch people to multiple meetings, and that may actually be, you know, there's a fatigue factor, I think, after a while. So if ultimately the board wants to have say over most everything in these projects and have an opportunity to weigh in, then perhaps we ought to really be looking at that first one of the board as the building committee. And simply being here, making the decisions, and there's nothing to say that we couldn't have an advisory group that worked with the whole board as opposed to the operations committee. That's sort of a hybrid of the hybrids, or a midpoint between those 2 options. But I think if everybody around the dais wants to be able to weigh in on every single decision that's going to get made in these building projects, then, you know, don't stick the operations committee in the middle of it. But understand that will mean a whole lot more board work. So that's part of what we're trying to balance here, is how much work do we want the board as a whole to do? How quickly do we want these projects to go? Because we can spend a lot of time discussing the governance, and we're not, you know, until we get that done, we can't get started on the actual building. So that would just kind of be my thoughts at this point, that we may need to consider if the board will is very strong to have everyone have a say in most everything that happens with these projects.
I just want to interject real quickly. I think Ms. Marioni has brought up another option that we hadn't even thought about, which I think may be a viable option. My personal feeling is that I don't want the whole board to be involved in every decision along the way, but I think that a hybrid model with a separate subcommittee for this purpose only might be a good way that we can get just those people that are perhaps most interested, but also it keeps it a smaller group so that we can move the project forward. I want to make sure we hear from everybody tonight so that we can get a sense. If we need to have more discussion about this, then this timeline won't work for us. So, you know, hearing from everybody about kind of where you are and your thinking of the governance structure would be helpful. And then I also wanted to say, as I've been sitting here, I've had some requests. We have just a very small group of members of the public here tonight. At the end of this part of the conversation, I'd like to just invite them to give us their thoughts on what we're saying tonight. So, but continue.
So based on that, Mr. Atkinson, Mr. Belfance, did you want to weigh in and give us your thoughts? Ms. Seeliger, you've asked questions, but I don't know if you've stated your preference. And I don't think that it's required that you state your preference. I think it's just, you know, I think we should give you an opportunity to do that, so that we know as we sort of end today and go to figure out what is it that we're bringing to the board, that we have, you know, that it's informed by everybody's perspective. So.
I share the concerns that Ms. Vendel brought up about the Operations Committee's existing work and how that might be consumed by the process. When we talk about the board, the option one, the board as the entire, as the building committee, that is going to be a lot of work for the board. And I know that the public would be invited to make comment on the action that we would make, but that wouldn't be as inclusive a process as it would be if we had an advisory committee. So I guess I would lean towards appointing an advisory committee myself. That would, include certainly board members, but also include members of the public. And I like the idea of an independent advisory committee as opposed to the operations committee, just because that would be more of a flat structure rather than, the public members and principals and staff being able to make recommendations, but then the operations committee members ultimately being the ones making the decisions. So there's a little bit of inequality there. So that's my take on it.
Ms. Seelig or Mr. Balfans?
So at this point, I'm considering the, right now, I'm leaning towards the administration recommendation and having the Operations Committee deal with this project. Considering that this would be, I think, simpler to implement with the Operations Committee and then bringing into the 6-member advisory committee as well as the staff instead of creating a new committee. I think that might be maybe inefficient, but that's just where I am right now. I think it might be more simple just to go with the Operations Committee, and because we haven't appointed, or the committee has not been appointed, maybe that can go into consideration of who's going to serve on the committee, and perhaps people on that committee don't have to serve on 2 committees. Maybe this will be the bulk of their work.
So can I just, because it's come up in both of these last statements, I think my rationale for recommending that it was the Operations Committee was sort of taking into consideration the fact that, it would otherwise be an additional committee. I did weigh the sort of the added responsibility that would go with this, and it's, it is added responsibility, but it's within an area where that committee already has responsibility. I would not envision their other responsibilities going away. I would envision this being an agenda item, a very substantive agenda item at some times, and other times it would just be like nothing happening on the, on the 4-building front. So that's, I think, the way that I was thinking about it. So it was trying to prevent the addition of another committee, which, as you know, is taxing on board members, and that was my rationale for that.
So I'm just going to weigh in real quick. I'm leaning towards the hybrid model that you had proposed, just going over what everyone else is kind of mentioning as well, with operations, standing advisory building committee. I'd like the idea of not the board committees can include non-voting community members as well. Then again, I don't want it to also be so big that it just becomes cumbersome. I would like to try to stay to this projections that you put for timeline. I think, it would be nice to try to stick to a timeline. And, it would be great to have all the board members included, but I just feel like it would just become way too big and way too bureaucratic as a whole. So just some thoughts on that.
Ms. Moriarty?
I just can't leave it with the operations, adding this to the operations committee work, having chaired operations for quite a few years, the things that operations committee does take responsibility for includes not only CIP work, but also transportation, food service, We don't know where we're going to fall with the state, with the other building projects. We also don't know where we've been working very hard on the full planning of how we're going to spread out all of the additional maintenance and work in all of the schools from our recent report. So I think there's just a lot of work still to be done in operations. And when we can take this into Tim's point around making sure that the vote is set so that it is not a board member has the hierarchy there of they can overturn or it wouldn't, because when we make a decision in committee, we're then referring to the board a committee recommendation, and it gives that added. In my mind, when I go to vote, I go, oh, the policy committee reviewed all this work, and they didn't put in the hard work, and now they're recommending this. If it comes to us and is an advisory committee capacity, then the board would still have the ability to vote, however we need to vote, and we'd get reports out. When you mention adding an additional committee, Ms. Davis, Ms. Thompson, and myself have been on the hall committee for I don't know how many years now. Granted, I'm not always there. You did mention that. But point being is that it does become a stretch. It is an additional committee responsibility, but we agreed to do that and serve in that capacity. And there are other hats we wear as board members. And so when we were, as a board member, to choose, say, yes, I want to serve as a board member also on this additional advisory committee, we would have to realize that's taking on that additional responsibility.
So your recommendation is to create
my
a
recommendation
separate committee?
is to still, again, this hybrid idea of separated advisory committee, apart from the operations committee and apart from the full board, still keeping it maintainable in size, ensuring that the public is on board, as well as council and board members, maybe more like 3 board members, similar to the hall building committee. That's my recommendation.
Ms. Thompson?
I'm not going to talk for long. I'll just say I concur with our new wise board member, Mr. Atkinson, that I like exactly what he said. So I'm not going to repeat it. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Mr. Rodriguez?
I don't think that I share the concerns of this going through the operations committee. Look, let me rephrase that. I think I have separate concerns, but I don't share the concerns that have been voiced. Like I said earlier, I do think that there is value in turnover, and because these projects will take so long, we will see different operation committees oversee this project, while we envisioning the advisory committee will remain the same. If we were to go with the special committee idea or hybrid of a hybrid, are we envisioning that special committee will remain the same throughout the scope of the project? Because then what we're asking of those potential special committee members would be, a significant
A lifetime
effort.
commitment.
A lifetime commitment, absolutely. And so those are, I guess that's what and to reiterate and to say again, I really do see some value in the fact that there is turnover in the committee assignments.
Do you want to open it?
I just want to add, I was envisioning that it would stay consistent, similar to the hall building committee. However, if a counselor or a board member is no longer on those bodies, then that person would be replaced, which did happen for the hall building committee. But the public members who would want to stay the same would be staying the same.
And a separate concern would be, as is with everything else that we do, and I want to point back to the comments that I made when we passed the transgender and gender expansive policy, and how impressive it was that we had such a collaborative effort with teachers, students, staff, board members, members of the public, incoming board members. So that was super impressive, and I don't want to say that I fear, but I want to kind of put it out there that if we have this intent to have members of the public be actively involved in this, having the operations committee oversee it, in a worst case scenario, which I don't think any current board member would do something like this, we run the risk of almost neglecting public input. Like we can literally change our mind or do something or recommend something different than what the members of the public might be advocating for as members of the advisory committee. So we might create a system where we're bypassing that input from the public. And again, I want to emphasize how important it is that the public is involved through the process.
Yeah, and I guess I want to just acknowledge that, but also remind you that ultimately the board as a whole is accountable for the project. So, where you don't vet and review and, sort of certify a decision, you are responsible for the decision no matter what. So, Ms. Davis.
I think my preference is that it work with the Operations Committee. I think it also is a way to keep these building and facility projects linked in and really efficiently from a staff perspective, because when we do a separate committee, we're asking staff to also staff more committees, but that we're making sure that these projects are staying integrally linked with the other facilities initiatives and work that we're doing, that it's really aligned well with the CIP, that it's, whatever synergy or thinking that we want to do that comes from the Sebago Technics work, that if it's in the Operations Committee and that's their work, that it is more likely to happen there than if it's a separate committee. And so that would be my thinking and my preference in terms of trying to make it efficient, make it run. I'm not worried about getting the other work done, and having also chaired the committee several times. I think that these are not big projects. The Operations Committee regularly deals with millions of dollars of CIP, and these projects, once we get them going, will get going, and we will be monitoring them, and it's a logical place to monitor them along with the other facilities work that we're monitoring as we go. So I don't see that the other work of the committee would suffer as a result of this being here. I think there actually are opportunities for consistency, building board knowledge, and synergy in having it in one spot.
So just before we move on to the next section, I wanted to invite members of the public that wanted to address us to briefly make your comments on what we're discussing tonight.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm Emily Figdor. I live at 31 Cushman Street. And I'm very concerned that you are not fully taking into consideration the scope of the overall $64 million bond. To think that you can do it within existing committee structure seems to not be fully acknowledging that we are renovating 4 schools, major renovations of 4 schools. In addition, the idea that an advisory committee, the hybrid model with an advisory committee would include just 4 members of the public. There are 10 members of the public on the Hall Building Committee that's looking at 1 school, but we're going to renovate 4 schools and just include 1 member of the public from each of those communities. That is a very minimal role for the public, and I worry that those projects will not be as strong as they should be because we won't have sufficient public involvement. These are smaller projects than the whole hall rebuild, but overall, it's a much bigger project because it's a $64 million bond. It's 4 projects. They're going to be happening successively. I'm hopeful that there's going to be overlap and we'll move as quickly as possible. This is a big piece of work and it deserves its own committee, and it deserves a robust level of public involvement and the ability for the public to really have a say. And of course, the final decisions are all yours, but the community should be able to be at the table as an equal partner in making recommendations to all of you. Thanks so much.
Hi, John Thibodeau, 114 Clinton Street. Echoing some of what Emily said, I don't know this, but is this the biggest project in modern Portland school history? Is it? I assume it is. It's a big deal. I'm a non-parent. The vote won by 65%, so there are, I'm guessing, tens of thousands of non-parents that also voted for this. So there's overwhelming support for this. This is a massive project. It's a once-in-a-generation project. To put this into an existing committee, I think, is not just. It does not. It's just not appropriate. I also think it's really important. This was a tremendous grassroots effort throughout the city, thousands of people involved, and I think to have this be a true process that represents where this came from and how it passed really needs to have strong, robust representation. So I support an appointed committee as well. I think it's really important. Again, I assume none of us will see a project this big again. And I hope you do it right, and I hope you do it with the public fully integrated and involved. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Ethan Strimling. I live on Congress Street. I am mayor of Portland, and I'm here in that role this evening. I want to thank you for the work you're doing. I think you just ought to give it to Javier. Let him do it. He can take care of it, the whole thing, I think.
That was my second choice.
I have not spoken to a lot of counselors. I did speak to Councilor Mavadonis. He and I had a conversation about this. I will say that what I hope most is two things. One, as much community engagement as possible. I don't know size. I think we can have that conversation. I think there are some arguments on one side that Hall School has been cumbersome. I think it's a very legitimate argument that was just brought forward that this is 4 schools and one person from each school may feel a little small to some people who have really been engaged in this process. It's not just the thousands of people who voted for it, but the hundreds and hundreds of parents who have been involved in this campaign to finally get us over the hurdle that we want to make sure they're feeling included in this process. So I would go towards the Hall School model much more closely in terms of the advisory. I think the governance structure of it coming back through you and all of that work, I think that makes sense. I've talked to Javier quite a bit on their legal analysis and all that work, that this is here and this should be here. I am very comfortable with that. The second piece, other than the community engagement, is the collaboration that I really want to emphasize, and that's between the school board and the city council. That is really key, I think, for trust. Remember that when we created the ad hoc committee, I worked very closely with then Chair Morioni. We together came up with a committee that we then presented and that was appointed. I think the same thing with Mayor Brennan, and were you chair at that time, Ms. Thompson? The two of them worked together, came up with the members, and then it was appointed at the council. I would suggest in this instance that your chair, Ms. Trevorrow, and I sit down and that we do the same thing. Now, obviously, it would come to you as opposed to coming to us in terms of what that appointment would be. But I do think from the council's perspective, that collaboration is really key. And I do think it does need to be separate. We did not, on the council level, when we created the ad hoc committee, send this to a committee we currently had. We created a committee, we brought both people together, and we said, you meet to focus on this because this is a big deal. So from my perspective, I encourage you to think as broadly in terms of community engagement as possible, but really key is collaboration because of the trust that we have been building to get to this point. I want to continue to carry forward with my colleagues and let them know that we will be working hand in hand and that Ms. Trevorrow and I will be sitting down to try to figure out how to make this work for both. Because remember, the council does ultimately have a fiduciary issue, so they want to be engaged in this. So, thank you.
So I was just going to close out public comment.
Do you want to close out this section? Should I move on, or do you want to hear more from people?
Other thoughts based on what you just heard, or other additional thoughts? Sarah?
So process-wise, December 19th based upon the mixed discussion here this evening, what are you bringing forward on December 19th? And should we wait, unless the committees are remaining the same as they are, then December 19th is when we're finding out who's on the committees. So unless we're just saying we're keeping everything status quo, then that's a different story. And I hope I'm not hearing that, but I'd like to have that conversation, or we discuss that before we jump into making a decision like that. So.
Do you want to respond? Do you want me to?
I mean,
I guess I would say, Ann and I meet tomorrow. That's our regularly scheduled, agenda setting meeting. I think we can talk through the sort of the feedback that we've gotten here and understand what type of a recommendation would make sense to bring to the board on the 19th. I think for me, what I wanted to do with this, which I think you get, is the urgency of making these decisions, because there are other decisions that we're about to talk about that will be, delayed by not, having clarity around who makes the decision around what's contained in the RFP, what's the sequencing of the projects, things along those lines. We've heard people say they'd like to see projects connected to each other, have some flexibility around it. That implies a set of decisions that are different from, we are going to start with, Presumpscot, because that was the one that, Oak Point recommended, and then we're going to go, when we're done with that, we're going to move on to another one. So I think all of those things are really weighty decisions that somebody has to make, and, we need to have a process for bringing those decisions and having closure around them so that we can, take the steps, because it's already, it's a 4-year project. There could be a 5-year project, there could be a 6-year project, or longer if we, if we spend 3 years making this decision, which I'm not saying we are, obviously.
You and Ann are going to meet tomorrow, and then amongst the two of you, what was heard tonight is what the motion will come forward next.
But I think that it would make sense to sort of circulate that to board members and, have people understand what it is that, that is coming out of that, out of this conversation. And, and I guess it's a two-way street. I think, if you have recommendations, give them to Anna, give them to myself, and we will, take those. And, obviously we've listened to what you've said today, so we have a good sense of where people are. We have a good sense of what the options are. We've heard from the public in terms of, they're wanting to have greater engagement and things along those lines. So obviously, we're going to take all of that and weigh it and come back with something that, that tries to pull all of those things together. That's the purpose of this conversation.
I think the thing we need to be mindful of, and I guess I would ask you to weigh your thoughts in thinking about this, is that we're talking about construction, and we're talking about construction of 4 schools for which we don't have a place to move students out. So we have very time-sensitive issues in an industry which is very time-sensitive. And I think that may be part of having done building and working with people who work in building projects. There are times that you need to get your RFP together, you need to get it out. If you don't get it out by now, it's not happening for a year. That there are some points that we can spend a lot of time talking about how we're going to do it, or we can also get it done. And I think there's a tension there that we need to be thoughtful and mindful of. If we want to spend time talking about how and gaining more input, we may lose the opportunity to actually get shovels in the ground in 2019, and it could get put off to 2020 or whatever, because we will miss the opportunity to bid. This was some of what we talked about in Hall, and we had a very tight windows in many cases to get our stuff out, get bids back in, get the workmen on, committed. It's a difficult construction environment right now. There's more projects than there are people. So I think we need to, and that's probably part of what you're going to talk about next, which is the timeline here, but we need to be mindful of that, because it's a tension between those two things. Do we want to get it done? And we've got to get it done with some real constraints in terms of not being able to simply move all the kids out and go in and do it whenever we want to. We've got to work with weather and where our students are and the type of work that needs to get done. So it's a complex issue, set of 4 separate projects.
Ms. Vindel.
Thank you. So I think we're, just to kind of go to Ms. Davis's point on timing, I think we're close. I don't think, from what I've heard, I don't think anyone around the dais who spoke sees that the board should be the building committee. I don't think that I think that the board has, desired to have, some efficiency around this work. I hear that the board is interested in having control over, the projects as, a decision-making entity. And I also hear that there's interest in having board members' engagement, whether it be the operations committee or a subcommittee that includes 3 board members and, advisory committee of community members. I think we're close. I don't think that the timing is too concerning, because I think I think we're close to where we need to be in order to make a decision. However, I do want to circle back to a point that Mayor Strimling made, and thinking about our relationship with the city and how important the city is as our partners in the facilities work. I think it would be a mistake to not make sure that we have our council and mayor support in the work as we're moving forward. I think that this could impact future relationships around CIP, around budget process, and I think that given how tenuous, the issues have been between the board and the council's past over the past decade, I think we're always trying to make sure that we are presenting ourselves as partners, knowing that, we asked the city council, the community to support such a large bond. It would be irresponsible for us not to incorporate a process in which they work with us, and that we have community engagement as a point of this work.
Okay, shall we move on? So let's talk briefly about the high-level timeline, and I'm going to draw heavily on Mr. Stilfen and Mr. Sherwood to help with this on anything that goes beyond the sort of the high level. So I think that the first thing that I want to impress upon the board is to sort of understand where we are in this project in relation to where where it fits into the 21-step process. This is, and you have an enlarged version of this in front of you, that is the sort of the state's process for school construction, 21 steps. And so I think it's important to note that we are, it's not, there it is. Okay. So the work that was done to date was the work that brings us up to roughly the equivalent of step 6 in the state process. And that, for us to actually get to the sort of the school construction phase, that means getting us to, at least this point 13, which is really point 17 in the state scheme. And so the work that we've done with Oak Point over the last however many years is not the level of specifications, the level of analysis in the projects that has us ready to go tomorrow with an RFP that would get us architects and eventually contractors. So there's a significant amount of work that needs to happen, and that's sort of this work of, meeting with architects, engineers, doing a deeper analysis of what is actually in those buildings and getting us to the point where we're ready to put an RFP out on the street. So that's, I think, a really important point for you to understand, because what you're going to see next is the slide, the set of slides that just basically outlines the one of the options for delivery, the one that, is most likely, it's the one that the city uses consistently in all of its projects, and the one that we wanted to highlight today. Again, not the only thing that, can be done, but the one that we wanted to highlight for illustrative purposes. And so this is what that timeline looks like, given the fact that we need to, make the decisions that we talked about in the first half of this meeting around the building committee and the governance, and then actually beginning the process of doing the specification development that will allow us to put out an RFP. And so in this model, you can see that, roughly from the, from the middle of March through, the middle of July, we would be engaged in a process of developing the RFP to go out and procure an architect and engineering firm that would then help us to develop the specifications that would be necessary to then go out and get a contractor. So under this which we think is realistic plan, we would be at the point of making a decision around a contractor sometime in October of next year. Board probably taking action on it in the middle of November, so roughly a year from now. And then having, obviously that's not construction season, but there's a significant amount of work that needs to happen, post having a contractor to be able to actually, break ground and begin the process. So, in this conception, we're looking at something where we wouldn't actually break ground until, midsummer of 2019. So, and that's, whether it's one school or whether it's a multiple set of schools, but I just wanted to make sure that, you understand and the public understands that there are significant steps that need to happen. We don't have a ready-made design that we can just hand over to a contractor and say, here, go build this. And, there's a significant amount of work that still needs to happen before we get to the point where we can give it to somebody and say, here, go build it. And so, that's what that timeline looks like. And so, again, the sooner we have a structure in place where we can make these decisions, I think the sooner we're able to begin that process and not delay this any further. So that's really it. I don't know if there's anything you want to add at a more detailed level on this, Steve or Doug. But otherwise, just sort of open it. Go to the mic, because it's on TV.
Steve Stolfen, Facilities Director. I would just echo what Javier is speaking to on this process and the timeline. Is the RFP is going to be the vehicle which holds these projects together. So the more scope that we can develop on the front end of the project will pay off in the triangle we're trying to manage of risk, time, quality, and costs. So this development period needs to be nimble, transparent, and able to move these projects in sequence in a pace that can take advantage of those three qualities in a project. So that's the timeline that would be optimistic to get started with a single school. Thank you.
Any comments or questions or anything on that?
I know I'm throwing monkeys in the wrenches every which way tonight, and this is my typical thing to do again. Just thinking outside the box, I know we've worked on Buildings for Our Future, the plan of it, 1, 2, 3, 4 in sequence. So it was a public member that brought to me the idea of, why haven't you considered looking at, okay, we're going in to do boilers for all 4 schools. Why not do all of those at the same time, and therefore you would bid out for boilers at the time? Or why wouldn't, but maybe people are shaking their head, and maybe I'm crazy, but it just seems a little bit like, and maybe Craig could speak to that, because if that's completely off the table and we've just batted that out of the ballpark, that's okay too. I don't mind that. I just wanted to throw it out there to see, because it logistically kind of makes sense, but maybe it doesn't.
The logistics that you're trying to gain here are an important element to consider here, is using boilers or mechanical replacements. If phasing could allow for the interface of that construction work without causing harm to our students, that's one aspect. So phasing who's in the proximity of the project. If we were looking at a roofing potential that had minimal effect on, say, I'll use the example of Reiki second floor, or Longfellow utilities that may be done down road in phasing as we look at, if it does start at Przumska, there will be opportunities to vet this through whatever method you choose to vet it through, that these ideas will be put forward and worked through the process of those risk aspects, the cost aspect, and the most important thing is the impact on the students in the schools. So that is how we would evaluate grouping, phasing, construction after selection of a contractor through this traditional process.
And I think I was just thinking of making sure we're optimizing summer time.
Absolutely.
For all 4 if we could. But again, it would take a different lens to look at this, and we haven't done it this way, and I'm just, like I said, I don't mean to throw a curveball, but just
no, I think that we need to do the forensics of where these buildings are now, how we craft our vehicle in the RFP to deliver the goods of these 4 distinct projects, and begin that communication and level of being nimble to actually get to where we need to be on target, on time, and on costs. So the processes that you're considering tonight are so crucial to the project. So, any other questions I can answer? Hopefully. Thank you.
I'm interested, you mentioned that the decision that we're making around the governance is so crucial. What insight do you have as we make that decision?
I can't give you an answer tonight because I'm still processing as you are, and being here only a month and a half and enjoyed every minute of it. I'm learning our communication abilities, our interface with the city, our schools. What I do know from my past experience is that the communication line is so important to make this decision, and the inclusiveness of the public and elected officials, both sides of the fence. And without using a cliche, we need to proceed as a team and have the ability to take the field and move down the field, if I can use that analogy. So I don't have a solid opinion on whatever you decide. I just know those are the criteria that I try to manage a project to. And I wish I could give you an answer at this moment, but I can't.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, Stephen, it might not be to you. First of all, the monkeys and wrench, maybe like English is a second language, but I didn't get the monkeys and wrench thing. So just, but I think, well, maybe I did get it. But so just to reiterate on the importance of communication, a lot of times the a lot of times the public does, come up with recommendations and ideas, and they voice them, and when we value that so much. So part of the communication, it not only needs to include the decisions that we end up going with and when we do approve, but a clear explanation of why we decided not to do something that the public had maybe consistently, quote unquote, assumed was going to be the direction that we were going to take. So, because I have heard that same idea of consolidating, certain aspects of the projects that'll be transcending all 4 schools. So again, as part of our communication as board members, as staff members, always include why we decided to not do something as much as, and to emphasize also, or to emphasize it as much as why we decided to go a different route. I'm still trying to process the monkeys and wrenches. Sorry.
It's a good analogy, though. Monkeys and wrenches, it really can apply here. The thing is communication is listening, and then giving feedback through the process. In construction, it's the same. I had a small conversation with Ms. Figdor here before the meeting, and we were talking about the process of construction. We were talking about acoustics in general and the priority that it has in learning, and where is that in the plans that we have now. They've been vetted, but we'll do the forensics, so to speak, yet again, and then get a communication on priority. And once we hear the priority, if there's established within our system a way to do this through procurement and clarity for all, then those decisions will be made and honored in that. And the explanations of where we reduce or where we add or how we come to the conclusions to make these decisions will be the closing of the circle of what we hear and what we communicate.
With this timeline here, how much input did you have into it? Did you come up with this timeline?
I did it working with Alicia, working with Javier, and with Doug Sherwood, yes.
Well, what are the consequences if we don't appoint a building committee by January 16th?
It would just extend down that timeline. There is some float in this, and most of the timing estimates that I used came from the Oak Point presentation in their final timeline that we've seen. And so that's how I established that with some real-life experience in timing. And it would move us down that, but would it impact a week to a month? Out to a month it would impact. We're shifting in seasons, construction, labor. There's a lot of decisions that need to be incorporated. Javier's talked about, superintendent has talked about those. Fair wages, there's a lot of things that need to be unpacked. We have, again, the superintendent, we have a lot of pretty pictures. Now we need to make those pretty pictures come to life. And that's our charge to do. And those are the decisions we need to make.
And we already did budget in the bond another person to help out with all of this, not for it to fall just on you. And so when do we hire that person?
We're in the process right now. We are.
Okay.
Yes, we are. We've met with some folks already. We're really working hard on the planning to get, we want to get going on this. We have resources. It's an incredible amount of money. However, for schools across this period of time, escalation, there's a lot of things that we need to be nimble about. And governance is something I know you folks can pull together and use your experience so that we can really, truly work together as a city and school department to get the very best vetting we can for our dollar before we go off into these projects with no phasing, tight phasing plans. What are our quality? What is our time frame? All of these issues. Who is really qualified to do this renovation? And that's where we're at now. But yes, to answer your question, we will bring in professionals to assist me.
Anything else? All right, well, we are at 9 o'clock, so thank you for your time on this, and we will, again, we'll meet tomorrow, begin to shape a recommendation around the governance. But I really just wanted you to see that the governance decision, while it's, not something that, it has to happen on exactly that schedule, it does start to drive us into sort of later time for, making some of the key decisions that go into the RFP. We are in the process of hiring a construction manager as a consultant now to be able to help us with some of the specification development and so on. So that's something that's already, we have somebody identified. We're in the process of, working through a contractual agreement sort of on a month-to-month basis until we get to a point where maybe that's not the type of person we need, and we need somebody to sort of be boots on the ground overseeing construction day to day. But for the time being, we do have somebody identified to help with the specification development.
So just back onto the timeline and the time frame. So
this one or the other one?
This one, just to put it very clearly, because we've been talking about timing as the most important thing. It starts with the appointment of the building committee. If we as a board decide to appoint a building committee in February, the beginning of February, how long will that delay us? I mean, my ideal is that we'll actually get to a resolution before then, but...
I don't think it delays us significantly. I mean, I think that we have a window there between March 19th to, and Steve helped me with this, between March 19th and looks like the middle of July to develop the specifications for an RFP to go out to bid. And so that's for the architect engineering, and so there's a window there that could be compressed. We obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we're hiring somebody to help us with the specifications, looking at the engineering of the buildings, making sure that we understand all of the things that we don't understand, currently, that were not part of the scope of what Oak Point did, so that we can develop that RFP. Some of those decisions, some of that work can happen, it's going to happen no matter what.
Yeah.
Things like, is fair contracting a part of the RFP, is a decision point that the board will need to make. And so, until that decision is made, until we make decisions about, do we want to do something that involves, a sequenced set of buildings, or do we want to try to leverage opportunities to be able to do boilers in multiple buildings? Again, not recommending it or not recommending it at this point, but somebody has to review all of those options and make those decisions, and that's why we need to know, am I coming to you? Am I coming to a committee? And, that's critical for staff to be able to move their work forward.
Okay.
The other thing for us to be cognizant of as we think about this is that in a construction project, time has a cost. And so when you compress a frame and you ask people to do more quickly, they will, but they will charge you more for that. If there's also the concept of opportunity cost here, and if we go out a little bit later with something, we may have missed having 5 or 6 or 10 people be interested because some of those folks are already doing something else. So and I sense this is already a fairly compressed schedule, so that the degree to which we continue to compress it may increase the cost of it. Doesn't mean it won't get done, but people will know that we have that pressure and they will charge us accordingly. That's just part of construction business. People will do stuff, but they will charge you more if it's not as convenient or easy for them to do. And so I think we do need to be aware of that. It may be possible, but it may change some of those other pieces, or it may impact the quality, because people will go through it more quickly. I think that our facilities director talked about sort of 3 points, and there are multiple perspectives and points in a construction project that all play into getting the quality that we ultimately want to have at a price that is as advantageous as possible for us, and on time. So we just need to be aware that every decision we make will have an impact on all of those elements of the project as it moves forward.
Okay, do you want to close it out? Just close it out? Closed.
Okay, unless there's anything further. So we'll take the feedback and we'll come back with something for the next meeting. So thank you guys for staying.